Good evening, everybody. Welcome. I'm Jennifer LaRue. I'm the Director of Public Programs here at the Mark Twain House and Museum in Hartford, Connecticut. And I'm so excited about tonight's program. The Marvel universe has become part of our universe, and it's something that has sustained us and entertained us and connected us with one another for so long, and particularly, I feel, during this pandemic, given us something in common to talk about. So I'm very excited to talk with Douglas Wolk and Sam Hatch about the Marvel Universe and all of the Marvels, Douglas's brand new book. Before we get started, though, I do have a little bit of housekeeping to do. First, I want to thank you for jumping in on the chat. Look at you all telling us where you're from and communicating with one another. That is the great fun of these virtual programs, isn't it? And when you come to our in-house auditorium to hear an author talk, you get to hear the author talk, but you don't get to chat with one another because you're not supposed to chat. But here you get to do both things at once. So I'm glad to see you already jumping in there. And Jacques, thank you for being there to help facilitate that. However, we are going to have an audience Q&A session toward the end of this evening's program. And if you have a question for Douglas or Sam, rather than put it in the chat where it might be hard for me to find, if you could help me out by putting the questions in the Ask a Question section at the bottom of the screen. There are already 3 questions there. That makes it a lot easier for me to handle the Q&A session at the end. So thank you for that. And while we're looking at that part of the screen, if you could just raise your eyeballs a little bit and look at that long green bar that says your support is vital to the Mark Twain House and Museum, please donate here. We have been so grateful throughout the pandemic for all the donations that have come in through these public programs that we've been offering. We've been offering 2 or 3 a week, and been very, very happy to stay connected with our audiences and to grow our audience internationally through the pandemic. But it's free to you for the most part, but it's not free to us. It does cost us money to put on these programs. And so anything you can do to help, $5, $10, whatever you can offer. I just want you to know that on behalf of the staff and the Board of Trustees of the Mark Twain House and Museum, every single penny is very deeply appreciated, and every single penny is put to very, very good use. Before I introduce our guests, I do want to point out that there's an opportunity to buy a signed copy of tonight's book, All of the Marvels by Douglas Wolk. There's a link in the chat that I will repost in just a moment. Usually I have a copy of the book sitting right here, but Douglas's book was published today. This is his book launch, his virtual book launch, and I did not receive a copy in time. So Douglas will show you a copy in a moment, but know that if you order the book through us, first of all, you get a signed copy. And second of all, your purchase benefits the Mark Twain House and Museum. And again, we're very, very grateful for your support in that regard. So go ahead and click that link and order your signed copy. And with all of that said, I'd like to introduce our guests. Before I do, though, I'd like to just acknowledge our sponsors. Tonight's program is sponsored by the Wish You Well Foundation and by Connecticut Public WNPR. And it's produced in part with support honoring the legacy of Frank Lord, our former longtime and beloved trustee. So our host tonight, or our interlocutor, as we say, is WWUH's Culture Dogs co-host, Sam Hatch, over here at the University of Hartford, a great friend of the museum, and he's a lot of fun. He's going to be a very good conversationalist with Douglas Wolk, who's a comics writer, critic, journalist, and teacher, and the author of the Eisner Award-winning Reading Comics, and the host of the podcast, The Voice of Latveria. A National Arts Journalism Program fellow, Wolk has written about comic books, graphic novels, pop music, and technology for the New York Times, Rolling Stone, the Washington Post, the Los Angeles Times, The Believer, Slate, and Pitchfork. And he joins us tonight from Portland, Oregon. So I want to bring them both on screen. Give me just a second to bring them up and welcome both Sam and Douglas. And let me just turn on your mics, guys, and we'll be good to go.
Excellent.
Welcome,
Great.
Douglas and Sam. Thank you so much for being here. And please hold up copies of the book. So while I, buy that book. And please post your questions and ask a question. And I'm going to disappear for now. But Sam, will you let me know when it's time to come back and help with the Q&A session?
Absolutely. Don't stray too far. I'm going to need
I
you.
won't go anywhere.
Yeah.
No. Oh, have fun. I'll see you in a little bit.
Sounds good. Thank you. Well, Douglas, congratulations on the new book. So
thank you so much, Sam.
Very glad to be part of the launch here. So I guess we have to kind of explain the basic premise of this book. But first off, I'm assuming you've been part of a number of other comics writing jobs, and you had an earlier book about reading comics. So when did you become an avid comics reader? And obviously, was it when you were young, yelling "Make mine Marvel" in the streets?
I got into it at a pretty early age. I think I started buying comics when I was about 9 years old, and bought an issue of Green Lantern, and then next month, there's another one next month. I have to find out what happens. Mm-hmm. Oh, this character is in another comic too. I should buy that too. Oh, this one looks interesting too. I should buy. Oh, there's a store down the street that sells nothing but comics, and they get them every week. And of course, like 2 months later, I'm a helpless junkie, and I have been for the last 40 odd years.
Yeah. I mean, once you're in, you're in.
You're in. Yeah.
And Marvel Comics in particular, were you more into Marvel or DC, or was you just kind of picked like a salad bar, depending on what you liked?
Yeah. I mean, in some ways, I was a DC kid as a kid. And, when you're 10 years old in the early 1980s, it's like there's Marvel and there's DC. It's like saying I like both kinds of music, country and Western.
Yes.
And by the time I was about 12, I was going to that comic store all the time. By the time I was 13, they're like, we're just going to teach you to use the register. And so I started working there and discovered all these amazing independent comics that were coming out at that time too. Discovered fantastic stuff that was being published in England and in Europe, and just been reading everything ever since. But I always kind of had a thing for Marvel stuff. And so the origin of this project was a few years ago. I had been invited to teach a class on the history of American superhero comics. And my son, who was then about 10 years old, he'd been reading comics with me all his life, but his deal was always, superhero comics. That's what my dad likes. Fair, right?
Sure. Yeah.
But he said, "Oh, you're teaching this class. Can I see the slideshow you're putting together for it?" Oh, superhero comics are a complicated system. I like complicated systems. Hey, Dad, I think I want to read all the Marvel superhero comics. Like, okay,
no small feat. Yeah, sure.
I was like, okay, this is going to last a week. It'll be a nice week we have together. It's fine. And then 4 months later, he'd read everything from like 1961 up to 1968. And he was like, Dad, I think I'm more interested in the modern crossover era. It was like, yes, we can do that. And I started thinking, like, what would happen if I read all of them? What would that look like? What would that 500,000 page story look like as a story? And the book happened. And 5 years later, here I am.
And in your original forays into reading comics when you were younger, how close do you think you came to reading or like chipping off a piece of that iceberg of that grand story?
I don't know. I mean, I was reading a few Marvel titles. I was reading a few titles from everybody. I just followed my taste. Like, nobody has ever been supposed to read all of Marvel's output. Nobody has ever been supposed to read any, like all of any comics publisher's output. The idea is you find what you like and you follow that.
Yeah.
And it's linked to other things and you can follow the links or not. So there were chunks of it that, as I came back to reread them for this project, were real familiar. I think there was a stretch of Iron Man where I was like, I remember this one. I remember the title of the next issue. I remember pretty much everything. This really made an impression. Oh dear. Oh, that's why I'm the way I am.
It's all clear now.
It's all coming back. Yeah.
Yeah. I mean, I remember in particular in the 80s running across all the links, and especially when they launched Secret Wars, and it was like every issue was just laden with these little kind of footnotes saying, see ish this, and that led me into picking up Iron Man because I was already a Spider-Man guy. So but I got to see what happens in that ties into the
exactly. That's how they get you.
Story. Yeah. So when you're talking about superhero comics, so you had to kind of leave some things by the wayside, things that were toy tie-ins or like the Conan series and things like that didn't.
Yeah, I mean, the rule I set for myself was if the version of Spider-Man who appears in The Amazing Spider-Man, like the familiar Peter Parker Earth Spider-Man, could potentially appear in a comic, whether he does or not. But if he could potentially appear in it without using a time machine and without traveling between dimensions, then I had to read it. So that was kind of an excuse to get out of reading a lot of Conan comics and a lot of Western comics and a lot of war comics I didn't really want to read.
Yeah.
But then I went ahead and read a lot of other stuff too. I read all the romance comics that Marvel published from 1960 onward.
Wow.
There's some great stuff. I read all the monster comics.
Yeah.
And really, before Marvel started being known for superhero comics in 1961-62, they had two main stocks in trade. They published monster comics, and they published comics about young professional women and teenage girls. And sometimes romance comics, sometimes comedy comics. And monsters plus romance plus comedy is more or less the superhero comics that they came up with.
Yeah, and you're thinking about just reading all these superhero stories, everyone thinks, capes and things like that. But there's so many different genres that it dips into, from science fiction to horror, monsters. Obviously, you cover in the book, and yeah, the Linda Carter kind of interstitial chapter was pretty fascinating as well.
Linda Carter, student nurse. Yep.
Yeah.
So that, for the benefit of the folks listening at home, Linda Carter, Student Nurse is a comic that debuted 2 months before Fantastic Four #1 in 1961. There are 9 issues of it. It is pretty much deservedly forgotten. It's not super well known for a reason. But Linda Carter, the student nurse, stuck around. She showed up again in the early 70s in a comic called Night Nurse.
Yes.
And then she turned up again in the early 2000s, having opened a clinic for injured superheroes where they could get treated, no questions asked. And she stayed around. She dated Dr. Strange for a while. She was involved in the superhero Civil War, and she's still around. She is a woman who has been in the background, who is not special, not superpowered, just trying to do good in the world. And I love thinking of the Marvel story as her story.
Yeah, that was, I like that. A lot of the chapters are, there's plenty of Fantastic Four, there's plenty of Spider-Man, but there's these little bits where you learn about Linda Carter, or, was it Squirrel Girl?
Squirrel Girl.
Unbeatable
I love Squirrel
Squirrel
Girl so much.
Yeah. So if you're coming at the book just thinking, it's just going to be all about Spider-Man, there might be something else in here that you're going to be surprised about along the way. So I love the way the characters that you don't think are important end up becoming important. Like you mentioned Dazzler quite a bit in here, which was like a disco Casablanca Records potential cash-in, and then became part of the X-Men.
Yeah. I was just looking today at a very strange comic I didn't get to mention in the book, which was Night Cat. So,
oh wow, yeah.
Dazzler was Marvel's attempt to jump on the disco bandwagon about 3 years too late. Originally, she was going to be a co-production with Casablanca Records, which was the big disco label, and there was going to be a singer who would be Dazzler and go out on the road and perform as Dazzler. That didn't happen. She just became the slightly late disco character in the comics. In the early 1990s, they tried doing it again with an actual singer who called herself Nightcat and wore a costume. And Stan Lee wrote the first issue of the Nightcat comic, which was the only issue of the Nightcat comic. And the Nightcat album came out and it bombed and let us never speak of it again. Yep. But it's a thing.
Do you have the old, like the Peter Parker Spider-Man albums and reflections of a superhero?
I wish I had rock reflections of a superhero.
Yeah.
That would be a lovely thing, but I do not have that. I do own a copy of that single Nobody Loves the Hulk.
Oh yeah, nice.
Which is a garage rock single from the late 60s. Kind of rocks.
I know some of this stuff is actually, it's cheesy, but it rocks. Yeah. And so you're probably one of those people. Oh no, I lost my camera.
Oh no, no camera, no.
Let's bring this back. So you're probably one of those people like I know who can watch now an episode of Loki and say, oh, that's not just a mysterious guy in a creepy realm. That's Kang the Conqueror. So you must know all these characters by heart now.
Yeah. I watch the Marvel TV shows whenever there's a new one with my family. And my kid is also, he's not quite as deep down the rabbit hole as I am, but he's pretty deep down the rabbit hole. So, in the Loki show where we get a 2-second shot of Frog Thor in a glass, we were both like, Frog Thor! Yeah. And my wife was like,
what?
The what?
Yeah.
What the? Yeah, okay, fine. Frog floor.
Yeah, just deal with it. Well, that's the beauty of the. I mean, the comics and the films and the shows in general. They play on a certain level, and you don't need to have all those details in the background. But they don't have to work very hard if they know that you know all this stuff. They just have to drop some little brief visual reference, and you're into it.
Yeah, one of the things that I love about it is that they handle it so beautifully that there are things that signify stuff to people who have been reading this stuff for years and care deeply about it, know all the minutiae. And if you're not one of those people, it's fine. It's still a really entertaining story. It doesn't even hint that you're missing something, because you're really not missing anything. You are getting the story, but maybe you get something extra too.
Yeah, and when a lot of people hear about this, they think, wow, reading all the comics and thinking of it as one epic story, it seems rather outlandish. But you do mention that there are a lot of Redditors, and there's people that are also pretty devoted to treating this as the Marvel comic line as one big story. So do you have some kindred spirits out there that?
Yeah, I mean, it really is one giant story. There's a thing called the Marvel Chronology Project, which devotes itself to figuring out the order of appearances of every character who has ever appeared in Marvel's comics. There are thousands and thousands of these characters. But what is the exact order of appearances of Doctor Doom? What is the exact order of appearances of any character you might name? What is the exact order of appearances in Marvel's comics of Clark Kent, who's appeared about 20 times? There's a lot of cameos by the dude with the glasses who might have a little secret on their suit, but yeah. But it really does all work as one story, though. Any one episode of any comic can refer to any earlier episode. They're all, as they're coming out, supposed to be consistent with each other. They are mostly consistent with each other. You can nitpick, you can find gaps, you can find loops, you can find places where the chronology doesn't make a lot of sense. But even then, people like the Chronology Project have these wonderful, sort of thoughtful, very polite, very almost Talmudic discussions of exactly how do we square this circle. When I was initially reading with my son, he was very interested in making sure that all the parts lined up. Like, that's the way that his brain works. And we got to a point fairly early on where, without getting into too many details, basically A has to happen before B, B has to happen before C, C has to happen before A. Yeah. How do you reconcile that? So it's like, okay, well, let's see what sort of explanations people have offered. So we looked around online, and we saw people's explanations of this, and the one that he decided he liked and was going to go with was that Daredevil was wearing his red suit before he believed he was wearing his red suit in public, and didn't know because he's blind. Great. Okay.
That works.
Go ahead, kid.
Yeah. So now, if you're reading about a particular hero like Spider-Man, who's got 3 series running at the same time, like in the 80s, there was like Amazing Spider-Man, Peter Parker, The Spectacular Spider-Man, and Web of Spider-Man. Did they routinely have an order in which those timelines happened, or did they kind of mix and match? Like some 1 month, like the events in Web would happen before Amazing, or was there any kind of
Well, you are asking this question as somebody who remembers that period, and there was a little while, specifically in like 1989, where it was handled like the Superman books were DC a few years later, where it's Web and then Spectacular and then Amazing every month. Like that is the order.
That's the order.
They have. They tried it again a few years later. It's real tough to do that if you have 3 different creative teams doing stuff at the same time and trying to make sure that everything is self-contained and everything dovetails. That's really hard. For a while in the 80s, they were printing like a guide in most issues of the Spider-Man titles. Like, okay, so these 3 issues of Web of Spider-Man happen between pages 15 and 16 of this issue of Amazing. And that got a little rococo. Eventually, it was just left to the readers as an exercise. You figure out how these things go together. If Spider-Man is appearing in 2 different serials that are being published at the same time, one of them happened before the other, which we're not going to tell you. That's going to spoil the surprise. You'll figure it out.
Yeah.
Great. And it almost always even by accident, works.
I so appreciate it, which I'd never thought about. I was, read the old Ditko Spider-Mans and the Romita stuff from the 70s, but you mentioned that there's this kind of sliding timeline that everything, everything that you think about happened in Spider-Man's past was what, just 15, 16 years ago? Was that the?
Yeah, I mean,
Yep.
Peter Parker got bitten by the spider when he was, let's say, 15.
Yep.
There can't have been more than 14, 15 years that have gone by since then.
Mm-hmm.
So everything since the beginning of the Marvel story happens in 14 or 15 years.
Mm-hmm.
This stuff published in 1961 forward. So what do you do when, there's a scene where John F. Kennedy is president, right?
Yeah.
The solution that, bless these nerds, have come
Blessed
up with
be the nerds.
It is the sliding timeline. So if there is if there's a reference that doesn't square up with everything having happened since 2006, that is a topical reference which was inserted into the story as published in the 1960s or 1970s or whatever to backdate it. That's a real convenient piece of legal fiction.
I like it though. Yeah. And that was always one of the things that I would try and wrap my head around as just a modest fan, and I've missed huge gaps in the timeline. But I think now, how do they square away that Spider-Man's doing this when he was doing things back in the 60s? So that's actually rather clever. So I appreciated that. And the first, I gotta say, like 40 so pages are just structured so well, where you're setting up basically the entire premise of this journey and how you're approaching it, and you're like completely able to guess whatever question I had next and then answer it. So as a reader, it's completely fulfilling, because you're like, well, what would he do this, or how would he do this? And then sure enough, there would be the answer right there. Did you have a sounding board? Do you ask a lot of people for questions, or do they just come at you with questions?
Some and some. I had a couple of really, really wonderful readers who were just unbelievably helpful to me. There's the poet Stephanie Burt, who I'm actually talking to tomorrow for another remote event that's going to be for the Twin Cities Book Festival. Stephanie was incredibly helpful to me. Katie Pride, who is the owner of my favorite local comic book store, Books with Pictures, like read everything and just peppered me with questions on it. And Jessica Bruder, the author of Nomadland, who's a longtime dear friend of mine, and is not a comics person at all. I was like, great. That is exactly what I want. I need somebody who is not a comics person at all to tell me, where am I getting into the weeds?
Yep.
What do I need to explain? What needs to be clear here? And that helped a lot.
Yeah, and I think kind of fitting for Marvel Comics, where they would always throw in some sort of information in a footnote or a little blurb. You have these great footnotes throughout, in which you kind of excel at bringing the nerdery to like a next level. So the main text is fairly pretty breezy, and it's accessible. And then if you really want, you can dig into those little nuggets of super deep lore.
Yeah, that is just me ripping off David Foster Wallace. That is an infinite jest riff.
Did you come up with those as you were writing, or did you go back and reread the bulk of the book you'd written and add those in later?
I generally put them in as I was writing, and then realized this needs to. I like this enough that I want to keep it. This is not a darling that I want to kill, but it needs to maybe be down the bottom of the page.
Sure.
And I got to use them as comedy. I got to use them as punchlines. I got to use them as a place to put stuff that I thought was really interesting, but might interrupt the flow of the story I was trying to do, the guiding I was trying to do. When it really clicked for me, it was when I realized that the metaphor that I was working with could be a guided tour. I could be a person who has covered every inch of this territory and could guide people not to the tourist traps, not to the high points, not to the peaks, but to the places where they could find their own routes.
Yeah.
The places that they could do their own further investigation if they looked interesting. And that really appealed to me. And then thinking of myself as a tour guide, as a companion, as somebody who's like, take a look at that thing over there.
Mm-hmm.
That's what made it work for me, I think.
Yeah, there's a lot of love given to the choose your own adventure style approach at reading these comics, and this book in particular plays into that in terms of those. Or you can jump from chapter to chapter. They're structured well. If you want to learn about one particular subject, you can jump to that. So you'd probably be okay with someone reading the appendix first and then bouncing back. Yeah,
of course.
Yeah.
And the appendix is a whole other thing. Like the appendix is my attempt to write a plot summary of 60 years of comics in like 35 pages.
Oh, that's all.
So just figuring out how the story breaks down thematically, and there are some periods within it that were not deliberately divided into periods. There was nobody who said like, okay, we're at the end of Act 2 now.
Yeah.
But looking at it in retrospect, it
happened naturally.
Like it happened naturally. Like none of this stuff was intentional at first. It was not a thing that was begun with the idea that like it's all going to be one big story and it's all going to be connected and we're going to have this compressed timeline and it's all going to work and you'll see. It was all by accident. It just came together. It was a few people working in a few rooms, Jack Kirby and Steve Ditko and Stan Lee and Don Heck, and there are not a lot of other people who were involved with the first 8 or 9 years of the story. And then in the 70s, it expands a lot more. I think one of the most extraordinary things that happens around 1971 or 72, Stan Lee has pretty much finished writing Amazing Spider-Man, and he hands the keys over to Jerry Conway, who is an actual teenager. He's 19 years old. He's like,
perfect.
Here is our prize. It is a story about a teenager who is finding his way in the world. Go.
Yep.
And it goes.
Knock yourself out, kid. Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. And the reading this project, what was the percentage of physical media reading these comics versus digital? I mean, the access must be a little bit better now than it used to be, but you were saying there's still some gaps in the digital world.
There's some gaps in the digital world. I mean, Marvel Unlimited, which is basically their Netflix-ish all-you-can read service, is great. If you got the tablet, especially, like it's something like $70 a year for tens of thousands of comics. They don't have everything, but they have a lot of things.
Yeah.
And that was really helpful. I read a lot of them that way. I read them, as comics that I bought as a kid or as a teenager or as a 20-something or as a 30-something. There were comics that I couldn't find otherwise that friends lent to me. There were things I had to kind of hunt down. There were things that just kind of fell into my lap by accident. I talk in the book about how. Okay, so when I went to Burning Man a couple of years ago,
it's always a good start to a sentence.
I didn't mean to read any comics. The only comic I brought with me is that I brought a bunch of copies of an issue of X-Force where they go to the Exploding Colossal Man Festival, which is clearly the same thing. And then the man comes to life and they have to fight it. I brought those to give away. I wasn't going to read anything else. I was like, I'm taking a little break from reading right now. And then somebody had set up a memorial shrine to Stan Lee there. And it had a little sign that said "Read Me," and then the base of the shrine, there was a box of like issues of Fantastic Four and Tales of Suspense and Tales to Astonish from the late 60s. And like, what was I going to do? Not read them?
No, yeah.
So I read them and I was like, I know what I'm going to do. I'm going to do bibliomancy. I'm going to figure out how I can get this project written. I'm going to take one of these comics at random. I'm going to open it to a random page. I'm going to point to a random panel, and that's going to be my fortune. It's going to tell me what to do. And it was some issue of something like Jack Kirby issue of Fantastic Four. And it was Reed Richards giving some kind of dire warning about radiation. Okay, I thought. So I went out for a little adventure that night with a friend, and we found a space to like sit and watch all the fireworks and stuff. It was a bunch of crates that were labeled with radioactivity signs and biohazard signs. I was like, okay, it's an art project.
Yeah.
Maybe this is what that thing that the divination is pointing me to. It's, it looked menacing, but it's actually totally innocent. It's totally fine. And we sat on them and we had a great time. And I felt a little sting at some point. I didn't think anything of it and got back to where I was staying, and the next day noticed I had an enormous spider bite.
Oh no.
Like huge, painful spider bite on my bed. There's no spiders in the Black Rock Desert. There's no spiders at Burning Man. It's a desert. There's nothing alive out there. And yet, giant spider bite. It was like, I got bitten by a radioactive spider.
And now you have powers, so.
Now I have all the responsibility and none of the power.
Sadly. So you won't go on vacation, you go to Burning Man, you find time to read comics. During this whole period, did you set apart a portion of the day for reading comics, or did you just kind of read them casually whenever you felt like it?
It was my job. Like,
yeah.
I had a contract to write a book. It was my full-time job. I sat down in the morning once my kid had gone to school, and I read comics until my eyes couldn't take it anymore. And then I took a little break, and then, so you ever hear of Flaming Carrot back in the 80s?
Oh, indeed, yes.
Flaming Carrot is a guy who read 5,000 comics on a dare, and his mind couldn't take it, and he cracked and put on like a giant burning carrot costume. That was me. I cracked. Yeah.
Were you ever reading and have to shoo someone away and say, "Leave me alone, I'm working," and then flip the page of the
comic? Not so much. I mean, I tried to still be a social human being and a decent family person. And I would read on a treadmill. I would read on public transportation on my phone. I just read wherever I had the chance. I'm a fast reader.
Yep.
It took a while anyway. Some of it was really, really fun. Some of it was great. I had a giant spreadsheet, and I didn't read in order. I grazed. I just went from place to place, whatever I felt like reading on any given day. Like today, I'm going to read some Captain America. Today, I'm going to read some comics drawn by Liam Sharp. Today, I'm going to read some horror comics from the 70s. Whatever I felt like. And so I just crossed stuff off the spreadsheet as I got done with it. And eventually, as I got near the end, I realized there were a few areas on the spreadsheet that were still really pretty untouched. And I just kept not feeling like reading them. I was like, okay, I said I was going to read everyone. I'm going to have to read everyone. This is how I ended up locking myself into an apartment in New York for 11 days with a bunch of protein drinks and the complete run of The Punisher.
Oh yeah. That's a love it or hate it kind of endeavor. Yeah.
that was the moment that I had to pass through.
You made it. You're here on the other side. So
take my punishment. Yep.
Good job. Yeah. I mean, a lot of the 13-year-old men that I went to school with, they thought the Punisher was the bee's knees. Yeah, that was, all the character development and that you needed was just, revenge.
I mean, there are some latter day Punisher comics that accurately treat him as just kind of a horribly toxic, horrific disaster of a person.
Yeah. And not celebrate it. Yeah.
Yeah. I tend to be a little more, I tend to have an easier time with those.
Yeah. And you do a really good job at trimming the fat, so to speak. And some other people might enjoy some of the fat, but you do a great job kind of highlighting these great moments and then saying, oh, and then like 20 years of Fantastic Four was just the same, like 5 kind of story tropes happening over and over again. But did you make notes of like whenever something you came across, did you have to keep a spreadsheet of all these kind of moments that you're like, oh, that's good? Or did you just have good recall?
I kept a Tumblr. I kept allofthemarvels.tumblr.com. Actually, I kept 2 Tumblrs. One of them was that one where I just like clipped any panel I thought was interesting. And that was really useful as a reference later on. And I could generally remember the storylines. If I got into a period that was really good of something, I was like, oh, this is good. Oh, I'm into this. Like I didn't have to take notes on like, this is good. I like this. There was a second Tumblr that that actually my kid came up with, which is marvelba.tumblr.com. which was just anytime somebody said "ba," clip that panel. Ba, yeah. There's a ba on the cover of Avengers #1.
Nice.
Yeah. Loki says, "The Avengers, ba, I'll destroy you all."
It's prime ba.
Yeah.
It was great. It reminded me of so many comics that I'd read when I was younger that I forgot about. Like I totally forgot about Power Pack and like Alpha Flight. I vaguely remembered, but so now I kind of want to dig through my long boxes. And
I gotta ask you, what was your favorite?
Yeah, for Marvel, it was Spider-Man was my main one, but then I liked all these weird like, kind of little things. Like I liked the Long Shot series, and he became an X-Men member. And then I liked a lot of the epic comic stuff, which isn't actually part of this, like Alien Legion and Dreadstar and all that. So, Spider-Man was definitely my go-to Marvel character, though. So I had the lucky thing of picking them up as they were coming out in the 80s, and then also have raided my dad's collection of older material. So,
I will say that Longshot miniseries was written by Ann Nesenti, who is one of the most interesting people you will ever meet. She's still writing comics occasionally. She did a really interesting miniseries called The Seeds with Dark Horse that came out a little while ago. And she's fascinating. Like, after she left comics for a while, she started making like documentaries about falconry in the Balkans.
Wow.
She's great.
That's awesome. I learned so many things from the book that because I didn't read Civil War. I just saw the movie. So I know, shame on me. But I was excited that Stamford, Connecticut got destroyed, not Sokovia. So now I'm disappointed that Stamford, Connecticut didn't have its big moment in the MCU.
Yeah. The Stamford thing was a pretty big thing in the comics for a while.
Which Marvel film do you think got it right the most? Like 86 Howard the Duck, or?
Got it right. Got it right is a tricky question, because there's faithfulness to the comics, and then there's doing the thing that makes a great movie. I would always rather see the thing that makes a great movie. I don't care what they do with the source material. The source material is a comic book. It is written and drawn by particular people. It is drawn by somebody's specific eye and hand. It is that expression of their personal creative style in a way that the movie is not supposed to be. A movie, like a live action movie, has the suggestion that it is what you would have seen if your eyes had been in the right place in the right time. That said, my favorite of all the Marvel movies, Spider-Man Into the Spider-Verse.
Yes.
So good.
Took so many chances, very inventive. Yeah.
So beautiful. And, you as a long time, like 80s comics person, the version of the Kingpin you see in that is straight out of Bill Sienkiewicz's version.
Oh, I'm a big Bill Sienkiewicz fan. Yeah. He really kind of warped my brain, and I kind of looked at art in a different way after seeing his stuff, like New Mutants, and I've got some of his sketchbooks and things like that. So
he's so good.
Fantastic. Yeah. Do you have a favorite Marvel artist?
I mean, it changes by the day. I have a real soft spot for the late great Gene Day, who really only drew until the early 80s. He died of a heart attack at the age of 33. There's a big chapter about Master of Kung Fu in the book, which is the series that Shang-Chi originally appeared in. And Gene Day drew most of the last couple of years of Master of Kung Fu, and they're absolutely just exquisitely gorgeous to look at. There are people who are drawing now who I think are also amazing. There's a guy called Aiko who drew a Nick Fury series a couple of years ago that's gorgeous. Pepe Larraz, who's drawing some of the X-Men books now, he looks very sort of slick and house style-y at first, and then you look at his stuff and you see how much care he puts into composition and character acting, and just absolutely everything he draws contributing to a psychological effect. I love his stuff.
And now, so does this journey end now, or are you going to continue picking up every single title that is released?
Maybe not every single title. I mean, so I had a nominal stopping point for the book, which was the end of 2017, the Marvel Legacy. But I kept reading after that, and I put in a bunch of stuff from after that in the book, because how could I not? I don't read everything as it's coming out, because I'm not getting paid to read everything as it's coming out. But when I finished the book, I thought, okay, maybe it's time for a little break from this stuff. Maybe it's time to read some prose for a while. There's prose stacking up. And then I went to the comic book store that afternoon, as one does, and I was like, ooh, there's a new issue of Hellions. Okay, I got to read that.
All right, so it'll continue in some fashion. Maybe in another 16 years or so, you can do a part 2 of the book. We'll see. I think we have some questions. Let's get Jennifer back in here.
She's fantastic.
Rolling around somewhere. There we go.
I have to say, I have very little interest historically in comic books of any sort. I was
You do
hanging on
now.
every single word. You two are absolutely fascinating, and you
Thank you
should
so
take
much.
this show
you.
on the road. I laughed. What a fascinating conversation. And so, Douglas, again, congratulations. This is your book launch, but you're doing another event tonight in person in Portland, Oregon.
I am at Books with Pictures. They sold, I think, something like 450 advance copies of the book, and
Amazing.
so I gotta go.
Of
Got to
course
do
you
the thing for
do.
them. Yeah.
And Douglas was telling me tonight that something I didn't know, which is that Portland, Oregon is kind of the center of comic book publishing. Is that correct?
It's maybe not the center of comic book publishing. It is the comics capital of America. It has.
Okay.
It used to have more cartoonists per capita than any other city, and now it just has more cartoonists than any other city. It's got a bunch of publishers. We have Dark Horse, we have Oni, we have Image, we have there are a lot, and a lot of writers and a lot of artists. And the biggest comic studio in America is Helioscope Studios, which is in downtown Portland. It's a really great place to be into this art form.
Well, I'll tell you, Mark Twain was hugely, obviously continues to be a huge cultural influence, but you really make a good case for Marvel Comics being a pretty huge cultural influence as well. And before I start with the audience questions, I want to kind of invoke host privilege and ask a question. We were talking earlier about the role that Joss Whedon, who went to Wesleyan University here in Connecticut, has played in the Marvel universe. Can you talk a little bit about that?
I mean, even beyond the Avengers movie, Joss Whedon has written some Marvel comics. He wrote a fantastically fun 2-year run on Astonishing X-Men, starting in 2004. It's memorable. Like, it still has repercussions now. He also wrote Runaways for a while. Like, he's part of the texture of this thing.
Fascinating. We have some great questions from the audience, so I'm going to launch right into those.
Cool.
So Nicholas wants to know, did you read the early letters pages too? A lot of the early letter writers later became Marvel creators. Rascally Roy Thomas, Dave Cockrum, G.R.R. Martin too.
Mm-hmm. George R.R. Martin's first published work when he was 14 or 15 years old was a letter in, I think, Fantastic Four number 20.
Is that
something
right?
like that. And you would see these names pop up in the letter columns, and they are names of people who went on to write and draw and edit and publish comics and other things later on. And Stanley is being super chummy with them all, letters columns, and the line he's spinning is if you write in, you can be part of the Merry Marvel Marching Society. You can be part of this cultural movement. And I mean, that is transparently a lie, and it's also true. It's what happened. And people stayed with it. There was, when Amazing Spider-Man number 600 came out, the editor said in the letter column, "Hey, so our first letter column was in issue number 3 back in 1963. Is anybody from back then still reading?" And a couple of people wrote in, and one of them is Fred Bronson, who writes the Dick Clark New Year's Eve specials and has written a bunch of books for Billboard. And he was like, "Yeah, I was 8, 9 years old when I wrote in, and I wanted to be a writer, and that's what I became."
Wow.
It's amazing.
That is amazing.
Yeah.
That's fascinating. Jeffrey Oliver says, for every uncanny X-Men, there's a Team America. What is the worst book and why?
I mean, every comic is special to somebody. This is a thing I discovered when reading this. I had somebody asking me a couple days ago about NFL Super Pro, which is just what you think it is. And yet, I went back and found an NFL Super Pro thing that had a really funny, charming little parody of the mythopoetic men's movement in it. I was like, okay, there's some value here. It is historical value. It's not necessarily aesthetic value, but it is this comic reflecting the world around it of its moment, and that's special.
And I'm glad that this has come up, because when I was a kid growing up, I didn't read kind of Marvel comics. I read Archie comics and Richie Rich and that kind of ilk of comic book that we don't hear so much about. Can you talk a little bit about the varying cultural impact of those kind of parallel but unequal contributors?
I mean, that stuff, Archie Comics had a giant cultural impact in their way. There's the Riverdale TV series on now. It's still around. It's still floating around. The difference, I think, between Marvel and other stuff is that Marvel, from the beginning, or not quite from the beginning, from a few years in, made it clear that it was really all one big story. It was a story that these components all added up to, and it was a story that had a history, and the history mattered, and the history would have echoes all the way forward. That's really special for any kind of serial. It's true to some extent of soap operas, right?
Mm-hmm.
But also not quite the same kind of institutional memory kind of way, because once an episode is aired, it's basically gone. They're best of DVD sets and stuff. They're incidents that people remember, but it's not in print. It's not this artifact that circulates. And with these comics, there was this history. There was stuff that happened in comics published 10, 20, 30, 40 years ago that would have an effect on new stories that were coming out. And if you had read those stories when they were coming out, giant impact. If you hadn't, it still had the sense that, oh, there's this thing that happened a long time ago, and it matters. It's really special.
And so bold, and I don't know, so forward thinking of the creators, to be able to assert that so early on.
And it was accidental. Like, it added up to that. It was not a deliberate decision. It was, let's have some fun. Let's have Spider-Man meet the Fantastic Four. Let's have Dr. Doom come back and talk about what he did 2 months ago. Let's have Captain America, a character who we published back in the 40s and have basically not touched since then. What would it be like if he came back? Would people be into that? Would that be some kind of nostalgia trip? And suddenly there's this stuff from 20 years ago that matters to what's happening now.
And given the economics, I mean, book publishing is a whole different thing from comic book publishing. So the economics of the publishing world make it easier for them to take that kind of risk and to try those kind of experiments.
Yeah, I mean, the way that comics publishing works, it has almost always been real penny ante. Not a thing that you did because you wanted to make money, a thing that you did because you enjoyed it. Nobody had any idea that, 50, 60 years in the future, there would be giant movies with these things in them.
Yeah, right. Can they imagine?
That Marvel sold off the rights to Fantastic Four and Spider-Man to movie studios for very, very small sums, because it didn't seem like it was ever going to be that much of a thing, and they were hurting for cash. And okay, and you see where that went.
Right.
Yeah, there's that fun interstitial bit in the book where you talk about all the Marvel flirting with the movies throughout the years.
They tried so hard to get movies made for so long, and just nothing. Like you said, Howard the Duck.
Yeah.
Wow.
Yeah.
So our friend and colleague Jacques Lamar has a question that's aimed at you, Sam.
Oh no, he's barred. Kick him out.
I know. He's bad news, but
yeah, I know. All right, we'll see what he says.
He says, does Sam know of a heavy metal band that may have recorded a video at the Mark Twain house?
He's referencing a band that I was in that, yes, we recorded in the one of the auditoriums, and then we did a photo shoot in the house as well. So,
and what was that band?
Sever the Drama is the name of the band. So nice. Yeah, I have no affiliation with them in what way. Yeah.
We'll be Googling that the moment we finish
there you
this.
Go. Thanks, Jacques.
Somebody has asked a question. I've been working on a research project that focuses on the cultural side of being a mutant X-Man rather than the heroic side.
Okay.
Do you have any suggestions on how to find arcs or issues that have more of that cultural focus aside from Whedon, Morrison, and Fraction?
Yes. The last 2 years worth of X-Men comics, since House of X and Powers of 10, which is an absolutely fantastic book from 2019, have been pretty much entirely on mutant culture and what happens when mutant culture declares itself separate from human culture and settles on an island. The island is Krakoa, which is a familiar name if you're familiar with X-Men. And they declare Krakoa is for all mutants. That is the title of Stephanie Burt's new book of poetry about X-Men, by the way, For All Mutants. Krakoa is for all mutants. It is open to all mutants. They are finding common cause. They all get to live there. They all have to live together. They are making their own laws. And that means that, it's the X-Men and Professor X and Magneto and the Shadow King and Sabretooth and Mystique and everybody who has ever been a villain in the mutant comics. They have decided that their collective identity is more important than any conflicts they've had in the past, because that is how mutant culture has to survive. So it's X-Men is the comic in which this plays out, starting the House of X and Powers of 10 is the book that starts all this off. X-Men and New Mutants and Hellions and Excalibur, and there's like 10 or 12 X-Men related comics that come out every month now that are all set with the mutants living on Krakoa, building their culture, and it's amazing. It's so good.
Wow. Wow, fascinating. Thank you. That's a great question. Thank you for asking that. And Jan Dumas wants to know, what was the fan group tracking all the appearances again?
Oh, that is the Marvel Chronology Project. It's just like chronologyproject.com.
Thank you. Jan also wants to know, Douglas, are you going to be attending any science fiction conventions in the New England area next year?
I would love to attend some. If anybody feels like inviting me. I'm going to be doing some in-person touring. I'm touring California for 2 weeks at the beginning of November. Going to be doing some other events after that. I just found out about a kind of southeastern event that I will be at that I don't think I get to talk about yet. I'm going to be appearing at the Las Vegas Comics Festival in the Vegas County Library is putting on in mid-November. And I would love to do some stuff in New England later this year in the new year. So, yeah.
Well, it goes without saying that you have an open invitation to come to the Mark Twain House and Museum, and we'd love to have you come when you feel safe and happy making that trip. And we'll give you a tour of the house, and Sam, you can join us. And
it's great. Yeah, you got to see the house. Yeah,
it's amazing. So Mark asks, how do different authors and artists contribute to the character's development? What were some of the breakout issues, and were there parts of the Marvel story that had impact in the real world? So that's a multifaceted question, but it sounds like a lot of good stuff.
It's a big question.
Yeah.
There are certain writers and artists who have had an effect on the story that disproportionately large. Some of them are the people who were there at the beginning. Some of them are, the 80s moment that Sam was really into stuff. There's a lot of fascinating stuff then. There was Walt Simonson doing Thor. There's Frank Miller on Daredevil. There's the 15-year long run that Chris Claremont did on X-Men. It doesn't take that long a run to necessarily put your imprint on something. Jim Steranko is a writer and artist who probably has the highest ratio of influence to actual number of comics pages written and drawn of anybody. He wrote and drew 7 complete comics, 7 complete issues, and pieces of a couple dozen more. And so 4 issues of Nick Fury, Agent of S.H.I.E.L.D., 3 issues of Captain America, a bunch of other Nick Fury stories, 2 X-Men stories, a couple other things. And yet, we're still feeling the effects of his work even now. People draw homages to his very small body of work all the time. When there's a certain kind of mood or tone that they want to call up, you suddenly get a Jim Steranko moment. And he did this 1968, 1969. Like, this is a long time ago, but it's still being felt. As for comics' effect on the real world, that is a kind of a gigantic question. and kind of a hard to answer question.
Uh-huh.
There are a lot of echoes of the real world. One favorite moment I talk about a bit in the book is there's an amazing Captain America sequence in 1974 where Captain America is chasing down this giant criminal conspiracy, the Secret Empire, and unmasks the head of the Secret Empire, number one, in the Oval Office. And it's pretty clearly Richard Nixon, who then kills himself in a story published 3 months before Nixon resigned. Right? Amazing. Like, that's not even ripped from the headlines. That's, yeah.
So to have been published 3 months before, when would it have had to be created, written, and
probably another solid 3 months before that.
All right, that's interesting.
Yeah.
Thank you. What villain appeared the most in the Avengers? Asks Linda Hocking.
What villain appeared the most in the Avengers? That's a good question. I'm going to guess at the answer. And my guess is a trick answer, which is Kang the Conqueror, who's the guy you would have seen if you know, the Loki TV series, who is also Immortus, who is also Ramatut, who is also quite a few other people. They're all the same guy. So that's my trick answer to a tricky question.
I'm wondering if she was setting you up for that.
Very possibly.
Very possibly. We have the best audience members, and we are renowned for the good questions that our audience members pose. So I would not put it past Linda Hocking to set you up for that.
You're on the hot seat.
You're in the hot seat. So let me see if I can. So Jeffrey Oliver again says Spider-Man appeared in Transformers #3. Did this meet your rule for reading? And did you then read G.I. Joe, since Transformers appeared in G.I. Joe? How far afield did your reading go?
So, as I say, the version of Spider-Man who appears in Amazing Spider-Man had to be the one. I generally went by the guidance from the Chronology Project, who I mentioned. They have a list of titles that Marvel has published that are not canonical to their main story. And one of them is labeled Transformers. Yes, we know. And the idea is that there must be somebody who wears a Spider-Man costume in whatever universe the Transformers are in, but it's not the same Spider-Man. And I posed this question. There's a guy named Chris Sims who runs a blog called the Invincible Super Blog and also hosts a podcast called War Rocket Ajax. I was talking about this with him last week, and he said, like, yes, because Death's Head came to our universe, but he had to come to our universe from somewhere, and where he was coming from was the Transformers universe. Thank you for getting me off the hook, Chris.
But other toys like the Micronauts had a series, but they were pretty heavily integrated.
Yeah, no, the Micronauts are definitely part of the Marvel universe. Rom, Space Knight, Godzilla, believe it or not. Godzilla is part of the Marvel universe. Yeah. Dum Dum Dugan from the Howling Commandos appeared in every single issue of Godzilla. Yeah. Read all of Godzilla. So it's and you know, if stuff was an edge case, I read it. Like there's an issue of Ren and Stimpy that Spider-Man is in. Why not? Oh, wow. You know, I'll read an issue of Ren and Stimpy.
Yeah, sure.
Is there any intersection between the Simpsons and the Marvel universe?
There is not, aside from, you know, comic book guy's head.
Okay, well, maybe we need to remedy that. I got to tell you, I just had no idea, and now I can't wait to read your book. And would you both please hold it up again? And Jacques,
yes,
perhaps
absolutely.
you can help me out by putting the link up again. So listen, folks, this book is published today. This is its book launch.
Yes.
And we know you can go somewhere else and order it, but know that if you do purchase it through us, you get a signed copy, first of all. Thank you, Douglas, for signing book plates for us.
They are not just signed. Each one has a quote from a random issue of random 60s Doctor Strange story written on it.
That's
awesome.
amazing. That's absolutely amazing. So, and do know that when you do make that purchase through us, thank you, Jacques, for posting that. Your purchase benefits the Mark Twain House and Museum and helps make programs such as this possible. So, oh my goodness, I remember the day that I got a note that this book was coming out, and I thought, oh goodness, we have to have him come talk. And then Jacques recommended you, Sam, as the in conversation with person, and what a great evening it's been. So I do want to reiterate my invitation. When you feel it's safe and good, please come to visit us at the Mark Twain House and Museum. And if you do, we will give you your very own Mark Twain bobblehead doll.
How can I resist that?
That's
I don't think you possibly can. And Sam will join us. You get one too, Sam. So
score.
And thank you to our audience for this fantastic questions and for being part of this wonderful evening. And let's do it again soon.
Fantastic. Thank you so much.
Thank you. And good luck with your other event tonight.
Thank you.
I'm sure that meant something. But
Yeah, maybe. Yeah.
Good night,
Hail
both of
Hydra.
you.
Yeah.
And good night, everybody. Oh, stop it.
All right, we're done.
Bye-bye.